This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below. I said on Twitter earlier this week that you gotta pay attention, or at least you gotta keep an eye out for what people like to call Monday morning quarterback takes, or just takes about your favorite football team on Monday mornings. Because what happens is people who were focused on their favorite team's game, right? Whether they cover that team, whether they're national, right? You know, if you're a national reporter or you're a national analyst, you probably had 2 or 3 games during the day that you were paying attention to, and you were focused on those 2 or 3 games. And then everything else you kind of take care of the next day. And oftentimes, whether it be a national reporter or just a fan or whatever, you know, when you look into those other games, it's not the most well-researched look into, right? And I'm talking about mainly people who don't do this as a profession, but even people who do this as a profession kind of fall into this, where people end up having very opinionated takes about games that it's obvious they just watched the extended highlights on, maybe at best watched the condensed game, but didn't search for context. And just to give you a key in on my process and what I've learned over the years when I'm talking about teams that I don't cover on a day-to-day, I've learned it's a really bad idea to watch the condensed game and just shoot off takes based on that condensed game as if you watched the full game. Even if you watched every play, it's a dangerous idea. And this is going to get into my main point here pretty soon, but follow along with me. But it's a pretty bad idea because what I've learned through my mistakes is that just watching every play of a football game does not give you even close to the full picture of the game. I talk about this all the time. Football is not just a collection of numbers, it's not just a science, it's not just a sport. There's also a bit of artistry involved with football, which means games have flows. And the truth is, unless you're watching a game live, you don't really have a great way of feeling the flow of the game, because even when you rewatch it, even if you're watching the full broadcast version, it's hard to feel the flow because you know some things that happen, right? Like maybe you don't know the score, but you know something. So it's hard to tell where the natural flow of the game was. And when you watch the condensed version, you don't really get a good idea for the natural flow of the game. You also don't get a good idea of what penalties were happening where, because sometimes they include that in the condensed cut, sometimes they don't. You really have no idea with the injuries. That's a big one. You kind of have to do your own context searching for that. It's kind of one of those things that's hard to tell. So when you're evaluating a game that you were not able to catch live, you lose a lot of context, is my main point. And that loss of context can create some major disconnects. And it's why when you wake up on Monday mornings, you will see takes that make absolutely no sense to people who watch the game live. Like you'll see people say things that nobody was saying after watching the live games, or your fan base generally comes to a bit of a consensus after the live game what went wrong, what went right, who was good, who was bad. And then like the next morning, all these other people who did not watch the live game will throw their 2 cents in. And all of a sudden you're seeing things that you're like, nobody thought that yesterday. Why do people think that now? And it's that loss of context. When you're not able to watch the game live, when you're not able to experience it live, you're going to miss things like the flow of the game. You're going to miss things like injuries. You're going to miss things like context. And also oftentimes when you go back and watch a game after it's already ended, you tend to watch a game with something in mind that somebody pointed out to you. Oh, this player didn't play well. So now you're going to look at this player and how they played extra hard. You're going to pay extra attention to that. And you're going to probably be looking for reasons to see why they didn't play well. So that's why that whole phenomenon happens. I say all this to say, this is something that kind of occurred this week with the Browns, right? Because after the game on Sunday, most people who watched the game had this take. And you heard this take on my videos. You heard this take on my live stream recap. You heard this take. Hey, Deshaun in the passing game was not great. It did not look clean. Or it didn't execute at the level that you wanted it to, but the rain was 100% a factor in that. And it's hard to judge it or have a hard take about it one way or the other, given the clear and obvious conditions that affected the game. What I've heard it just a few days after the game, this was a take that everybody kind of understood. Even people who weren't the most positive about Deshaun Watson kind of understood. Hey, Joe Burrow threw for 82 yards. It was a rough game. It was rough conditions. And then the Browns got up early, so they really didn't have to throw. It just wasn't that moment. But hey, when Deshaun needed to make plays, he did make plays. He looked fine. So many people have gotten in here and said anybody who's saying that is making excuses, or anybody who thinks that he wasn't playing terrible is making excuses. Or like some of the interesting stuff that I saw, I think which guy was it? Was it Jake Trotter that got caught putting this in an article? I've seen people acknowledge that the weather was an issue for both quarterbacks, acknowledge that the weather was an issue for Joe Burrow, glance over his stat line, and then focus and harp on how bad they think Deshaun Watson played, as if they don't really care that the weather was bad. Like, on one hand, you're willing to dismiss an 82-yard passing performance by Joe Burrow, which I do think is fair given the conditions and the fact that the Browns have just done this to Joe Burrow before. That's why I wouldn't panic long-term about him. But then to turn around and be like, well, you got to be worried about Deshaun Watson because, he didn't look great, is just so disingenuous by some people. It's so lame. You don't have to do that. If you want to be critical of the Cleveland Browns, you don't have to reach. If you want to be critical of Deshaun Watson, you don't have to act like something that was clearly affecting the game wasn't. And we've been through this before. Unfortunately for Deshaun Watson, he's had multiple horrible weather games, and people have acted as if the weather was fine in those games. Because remember last year where people were pointing out, oh, well, he threw under 200 yards in this game that nobody threw over 200 yards in. You remember that? It was a Saints game, right? People will willingly ignore context when it benefits their point sometimes. And again, that's when people kind of expose themselves as those who have not been taken serious. So that leads me into kind of the title question of this video, which is, hey, are Browns fans making excuses for Deshaun Watson? Or was Deshaun Watson's play actually not that bad? And I'm so tired of being in this place. Like, I just want, for real, I really just want to be able to talk about the football. I really just want to be able to sit here and have an honest conversation about the football. But it just frustrates me to no end that so many people are dedicated to being dishonest about the football. whether it be in a positive direction, whether it be in a negative direction. When I say something that Deshaun Watson struggled with, so many people get mad at me. When I say something that Deshaun Watson did well, so many people get mad at me. It's so frustrating not to be able to have an honest football conversation about this guy because everybody wants to bring their own shit into it. The truth of the matter is, it was a bad weather game. The rain was crazy. It clearly affected the passing offenses of both teams. Deshaun Watson missed some throws. He went on to explain this as he was trying to change things with his grip. All of that is what it is. I said during the game, I understand that the weather is a problem. I'm not going to act like the weather wasn't a problem. What I said was I needed to see Deshaun Watson, Kevin Stefanski, AVP make an adjustment to get some offense going despite the conditions. My exact term was they need to find a way to be comfortable in these conditions because in Cleveland it's going to rain. In Cleveland it's going to storm. In Cleveland it's going to snow. In Cleveland the weather's just not going to be cooperating with the game plan. It happens all the time. You need to find a way to be comfortable with those elements, adjust to those elements, and win with those elements. And guess what? He did. Sometimes it feels like outside of 300 yards and 4 touchdowns, people won't shut up about what they feel like Watson should have did. When at the end of the day, what he should be judged by in this game is the conditions in which he played it. Joe Burrow, who many people think is going to win the MVP this year. Joe Burrow, who many people think is the second best quarterback in the NFL. Joe Burrow, who so many people, were really embarrassing themselves over the last few years, wondering, oh my God, why can't that guy be our quarterback? Why can't this be us? Remember all that stuff people were doing, especially when Baker Mayfield was the quarterback here, because we were so desperate for good quarterback play over Joe Burrow, especially in 2021. Like there were people legitimately who work around the team who are just flat embarrassing themselves every day in their thirst to want somebody like Joe Burrow. And I understand you want a better quarterback, but there's ways to make that point that people weren't doing. But so many people in this city who cover this team have thirsted over Joe Burrow. Rightfully so. He's very good. We know Joe Burrow's really good. So knowing all of that, knowing Joe Burrow's good, knowing Joe Burrow and the Bengals are a really good offense, why not give credit to Deshaun Watson for finding a way to do something that Joe Burrow could not find a way to do? Right? In those elements, first is a good defense. Remember, the Bengals were like the 9th ranked defense in the NFL last year, a top 10 defense. A defense good enough to get to the AFC Championship game and almost beat Pat Mahomes. A defense that's given Pat Mahomes fits. He up against that with harsh weather, he somehow found the way to be productive, to get a couple of touchdowns with his legs, move the ball, move the chains, get the offense going to a point where Nick Chubb could take over. It wasn't all Deshaun Watson. Deshaun Watson was the only thing happening in that game. Elijah Moore had a big play. Nick Chubb had a big play. But they found a way to get to the parts of the field because Deshaun Watson found a way to get comfortable, found a way to be productive. You cannot say Joe Burrow ever found a way to get comfortable, ever found a way to get productive. In this game, where the rain was crazy, the goal of the quarterback position was not, hey, throw for 300 yards and get 3 touchdowns and have a great statistical game. The goal of the quarterback position for both teams became find a way to squeeze some offense out. I don't care how you do it. You got to find a way. That is the job of a quarterback in an inclement weather game. The quarterback that finds a way to do that wins the game.